So, we are back. We are doing the second of two meetings on Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. At our last meeting, we talked about Chapter 1. Let's get that out of the way just real quick, just super fast recap, and then we can get to Corbin's story about the Kit Kat wrapper and another story that I heard about who is it supposed to be? I think it's an apocryphal story, but it's about a philosopher trying to light his pipe, and it also involves Kant, and I'm not sure if these are actually accurate representations of the Kantian categorical imperative. But first, at our last meeting, we talked about the preface and Chapter 1 of the Groundwork, and we kind of eased into Chapter 2 just a little bit, but I don't think we got too far. The only thing that I did getting ahead of stuff that's in the preface in Chapter 1 is I called something the categorical imperative we even kind of went through a sample test for how would you use that principle. And that principle gets mentioned in Chapter 1, but it doesn't get called the categorical imperative just yet. So, in the preface in Chapter 1, we get a variety of things. We get this interesting, and probably the most important thing that gets done in the preface in Chapter 1, we get this little complex of concepts. Duty, the rational will, and the moral law. And in kind of typical Kantian fashion, I think we talked a little bit about how this Kant is not the only one who works this way. Jean-Jacques Rousseau kind of worked this way a little bit as well. The thing about this little cluster of concepts is that they all kind of necessarily seem to hang together. If we understand duty the way that Kant is trying to talk about duty, we'll recognize that the only way to act from duty is to act on the basis of motivation from the rational will. And if we're going to talk about a moral law, we'll emphasize that it's law, not just a moral suggestion or even a moral good idea, moral advice, or anything like that, or even things that are morally praiseworthy or blameworthy. If we're going to talk about the moral law, we're going to recognize that it's the sort of thing that has to be universal. It has to be absolute. There can't be any exceptions to it. We also got into a little bit of a discussion that perhaps is a little bit familiar because we saw it in Kant's Metaphysics and Epistemology back in the Prolegomena. We saw this distinction yet again between pure and empirical inquiry. Pure inquiry versus empirical inquiry. And remind me again, what's pure inquiry? What's that? It's without empirical content. All right, so what's empirical inquiry then? Yeah, using the senses. One of the things that comes along for the ride here is that pure inquiry is a priori, and empirical inquiry is always a posteriori. And so with pure inquiry, we can get, let's start with empirical inquiry. Since it's a posteriori, and since we know that Kant takes David Hume seriously, we might recognize that there's nothing in empirical inquiry. There's nothing that I can come to, no conclusions that I can arrive at a posteriori that are going to be absolutely certain. There are always going to be the sorts of things that are, how did Hume say it? All empirical inquiry, all matters of fact, all a posteriori knowledge is, where does it come from? Does it come from reason?
Experience.
It comes from experience. And because it comes from experience, what's it based on? Can I reason about experience? Kant is going to say, you can't reason about experience. The way that Hume says it is, it's always going to come from custom and habit, right? This feeling of certainty that, there it is. So that finishing of, the thing, that kind of, satisfaction of the expectation, that, all cause and effect, which is pretty much, all proposed knowledge about matters of fact, all proposed knowledge that comes from experience, empirical experience at least, is the sort of thing that it only really hangs together. It's a feeling of certainty. It's an expectation that hangs together because of custom and habit and perhaps nothing more. And because of that, it's not the sort of thing that one can ever be certain about. You can be relatively confident on the basis of the barometric pressure and the humidity today and various weather patterns that you can glean from satellites and stuff like that that it's not going to snow tomorrow. You can be really, really confident, but I don't know if you can be absolutely certain. And because we're looking for moral laws, right, that are universal, that are absolute, pure inquiry, the sort of a priori knowledge that comes from pure inquiry, is going to be the thing that we're concerned with, to do a metaphysics of morals. There's an empirical side to this, but it's not a metaphysics of morals. It's not going to give a grounding for any kind of absolute moral principles. All of the moral principles that might come from this are going to be ones that are based on descriptions of how people do in fact act. And morality is concerned not with how people do act, but with how they ought to act, and because these are two very different things, we want to root a grounding of moral principle, if there is going to be any grounding of moral principles at all. And they're not just going to be free-floating kind of descriptions of how people do tend to act. We're going to have to ground that in a pure inquiry, in something that's a priori. Another thing that we got out of our discussion about duty and the rational will and the moral law, out of the preface in Chapter 1, was this recognition that willing something is not the same as wanting something. Are we all cool with that? It's a kind of a difficult linguistic thing to navigate, because oftentimes if I'm going to talk about the motivation of the will, I might just kind of casually exchange it with saying that I want it or I desire it. The word wish might even come into play sometimes too. Aristotle makes a distinction. He never uses the word wish because he didn't speak English, but he uses the word boulesis that sometimes gets translated as a rational wish. So when we're talking about the will as kind of representing some sort of motivation to act, we're going to want to make sure that we understand that at least a rational will, a pure will, is not going to be motivated by desire or inclination or any of these things that get trained by experience or that are contingent. We'll get into this idea of contingency versus necessity a little bit today, but hopefully the shades of it are already at work here. And it's out of this. Oh, yeah, Pearson, question? Anybody have questions about this stuff so far? Yeah.
I think I have trouble with the will and the wanting.
Willing and wanting? Yeah.
Is it kind of I feel like in rational agents, we desire to be into the rational. So there is a desire, but it's a rational desire. Is that what you mean by the will? Because we also have other desires like bodily desires.
Right.
You might call it a empirical desire.
So what we might do is we might remark that both willing and wanting are both species of motivation. So we could say, I'm motivated to do what's reasonable.
Yeah.
We might also recognize that I actually do have a kind of a sentimental attachment to being reasonable as well. I might in fact want, in the sense of desire or inclination, to be reasonable. But Kant is going to maintain that, that's not the only reason to be reasonable. You should maybe be reasonable. In fact, it's perhaps evident in the way that I just phrased that. It's not the only reason to be reasonable. If you're looking for reasons to be reasonable, then presumably you've already recognized that being reasonable is reason enough to be reasonable already, right? That it's something that you don't need to appeal to any desire. And we might in fact even recognize that there ought to be at least this outside possibility that even in moments where you don't feel like being reasonable, or even in cases of people who have no sort of sentimental attachment to being reasonable, or even if you grew up in a culture where reason wasn't prized, that you would still perhaps, in moments of pure rational reflection, recognize that being reasonable is something that you can be motivated to without necessarily relying on the motives of desire. Is that fair enough? Yeah. And so the language maybe sells us short here, or the way that we've used language and kind of blurred all these words like wish, want, will, and kind of mushed them all together, is the sort of thing that Kant is looking to clean up and say no. They're, at the very least, if you want to say that they're two species of the same genus, then recognize that there is a very specific differentia to be made within that genus, right? That this is the one that is based on rationality, this is the one that's based on sentiment, inclination, desire, etc. So we can talk about rational wishes, perhaps, if we want to say that. We can, even if we really want to, go ahead and let all the words get blurred together, but we're still going to maybe want to qualify that I have a rational desire versus an irrational desire to do something. Corbin, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I think I had a similar grievance with the will not equal.
The will want thing? Yeah.
That Pearson did, and that it almost sounds sounds like Immanuel Kant is like referencing Descartes' like ideas of like extended things and non-extended things. Like saying that like the mind and body are necessarily separate things, because otherwise how would someone be able to use pure reason?
Oh, right. Kant is not necessarily attached to that. Reason might be the sort of thing that's an activity of a material mind, right? Brains might reason. We would just have to be able to recognize that the faculty of reason is different than the sort of faculty that gives rise to, like, desire. That they're distinguishable. As a matter of fact, like there are kind of linguistic constructions that I think we can recognize, and we talked about them a little bit at our last meeting, where like you can stop yourself from going after something that you desire through the application of willpower. This is what we usually call it, right? Exercise your will to not just give in to desire, to not be a slave to desire. You can also perhaps train your desires a little bit. But then there's this open question, and we might get a chance to talk about this, depending on how time goes. We got some ground to cover today. Depending on how time goes, we might also be able to talk about, like, so what is the deal with, like, trainable desire, and should we try to train our desires? And Kant is not necessarily opposed to this, but there might be this open question of, like, how do you know what to train those desires towards? How do you know what virtues to try to cultivate, unless you can rationally set those goals for yourself without any kind of reference to desire, inclination, or wanting, right? Jack, you had your hand up?
No, we got ground.
Okay. That's okay. Like, I didn't mean to, like, scare off the question.
Don't worry.
Yeah? Okay. There'll be plenty of opportunities. And also, if you're kind of, like, thinking to yourself, like, I have a question right now, but I don't know if I've, like, really formulated it well, or I don't know if I want to waste time with my question. First of all, like, don't worry about that. Like, none of this really, like, matters if we don't understand all the steps. So if, like, we get to the end and you're like, whoo, we made it to the end, but I didn't understand anything in that. And you're like, well, that doesn't really help us. And also remember that this is really just the same idea over and over and over and over and over again, explicated from slightly different perspectives. So, if you do have something that you're chewing on, you're like, I want to ask the question, but I'm not sure if I want to ask it right now, there's a pretty good chance the opportunity is going to present itself in about 10 minutes, in about 20 minutes, in about 30 minutes. Like, you'll get many, many opportunities because we're going to be retreading the same ground over and over and over and over again from slightly different directions. And each pass through, and this is maybe like a nice little synecdoche for what it's like to read Kant generally, or maybe even read any philosophy. Each pass through, you start to kind of like see things a little bit clearer. You start seeing the picture hanging together a little more coherently. Okay. So what we eventually got out of this, and this is where we left off at our last meeting, was this gives rise to a principle that I jumped a little bit ahead and I called it the first formulation of the categorical imperative. And I would say most people in 2018 who have heard the name Immanuel Kant before and, like, didn't just hear it in passing, like, there's a guy named Immanuel Kant, and he was German, and, like, that was the end of what you heard. If you heard anything about, like, the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, you probably heard about the categorical imperative, and you probably heard about the first formulation. Maybe you've heard about the second formulation of the categorical imperative. Doubtful that, unless you've, like, sat down and read through the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, doubtful that you got all of this kind of like grounding for where that categorical imperative comes from. It doesn't just fall out of the sky. Kant doesn't just make it up and say, like, here's an idea, try this on. He puts it forward as the sort of thing that seems necessary. And that categorical imperative is as follows. Act always such that you could will the maxim of your action as universal law. Bink, bink. Okay. So one way of thinking about this would be maybe something that isn't so new, that isn't so unfamiliar, despite the fact that Kant maybe might present it in something that seems fairly novel and unfamiliar in a kind of like a foreign sort of a phrasing. My guess is at some point in your life, somebody has asked you, well, what if everybody did that? And just kind of like left that question hanging as if like, well, you can just kind of finish the argument all on your own. So Corbin was telling a story before class started about seeing, like, was it a Kit Kat wrapper?
Yeah.
Saw a Kit Kat wrapper on the ground, and for a moment you were like, should I pick it up? And you were like, but I don't want to. Maybe you were busy, maybe you had other stuff to do. And then you ask yourself, like, what if nobody picked up the Kit Kat wrapper? Maybe perhaps to say it like a little more fitting with this, what if everybody didn't pick up the Kit Kat wrapper? Then the Kit Kat wrapper would be there forever. Or perhaps a slightly different sort of a story. I wish I could remember who it's supposed to be. You guys, have you heard these like urban legends about like maybe like students who do like totally badass things in class? Like the philosophy student who like in an exam where the question was, what is courage? And the student like writes on the exam like this is, and like just turns that in. And they're like, oh, and the student gets an A. I don't know if that like ever happened, or if it was just like somebody's like idea, like, wouldn't it be cool if this happened? But there are stories like this that kind of like run around philosophy departments as well about badass philosophers. And one of those stories involves a philosophy professor who's in New York City, and it's a windy day, and he's trying to light his pipe, but it's too windy, because all philosophy professors smoke pipes. He's trying to light his pipe, but it's like way too windy, and so he goes down into like the steps into the subway station to light his pipe. And as he's doing that, a police officer walks by and sees him and says like, hey, there's no smoking on the subway. And the philosophy professor says, well, I'm just trying to get my pipe lit, and then I'll just come right back out. I'm not like trying to smoke on the subway. And the police officer says, yeah, well, what if everybody did that? And then the philosophy professor says, who the hell are you, Kant? And then the police officer supposedly like doesn't hear him quite clearly and gets very upset for some reason. And so yeah, that's that story. There are other stories that are supposedly about like the same professor that are like equally kind of funny and maybe a little bit badass. That's the version of a badass philosopher, I guess. Like, who the hell you are, Kant? But in this case, we might wonder, like, how does that argument finish, right? Well, what if everybody tried to light their pipe on, like, in the subway station? Like, all at the same time? Well, this perhaps would be impossible, but I don't know. I don't know if that really, like, fits what's going on with, like, universalizing the maxim of your action. Perhaps it would be like that would be undesirable. It would be very crowded and people couldn't get through, and that would be like a real bummer or something like that.
If everybody was there, they'd have to light a pipe.
If everyone was there, what's that?
They'd have to stand there and light their pipe. They wouldn't be like trying to get through because they'd be lighting.
Yeah, because everybody would be sitting there like lighting their pipe, right? Yeah. Or maybe we might say like everybody would be there, and that, like where it ends up kind of like where the rubber meets the road for this is it's got to be something other than that would be a bummer. It's got to be something like that's not appealing to undesirable consequences. So if the Kit Kat wrapper story ends up with like, well, then there would be like Kit Kat wrappers everywhere, and who wants to live in a world like that? Notice that's an appeal to who would want to live in a world like that. That's about wanting. And notice that the first formulation of the categorical imperative indicates that we are supposed to act always such that we could will. This is a very intentional construction here. Act always such that you could will the maxim of your action. So again, like the maxim of your action as universal law. These are like the key terms in this, the key concepts that are at work. It's act always such that you could will the maxim of your action as universal law. And perhaps it is possible that I could will this. Could I will a world with Kit Kat wrappers everywhere? Could I will a world where whenever somebody needs to light their pipe, they go down into the subway station and do so? I don't see anything really stopping me from willing that. So maybe this could be the sort of thing that could be universalized as the maximum of our action could be willed as universal law. So like what's going on there? This also kind of comes back to this question of like the golden rule and whether or not Kant's categorical imperative is really just a rephrasing of the golden rule. And perhaps it is, but I think I mentioned this at our last meeting. It would have to be a very specific kind of version or an interpretation of what the golden rule looks like. The golden rule is usually expressed, how have you heard it? It's usually a do unto, like who talks like that? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. As you would have them do unto you. Yeah, so there's the ambiguity, right? if what we think about that is like treat others the way that you would want to be treated, and that's kind of the way, when I was little and somebody told me the golden rule and they said, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, I would have just been like, what 5-year-old is going to listen to that? Oh, I get it. Like, do unto others as you would have them do unto you? No. Don't treat people in a way that you wouldn't want to be treated. Or we want a positive formulation. Do treat others the way that you would want to be treated. But again, this is an appeal to wanting. So it would have to be some other very kind of specific interpretation of the golden rule in order for it to fit with the categorical imperative. We've already seen some other kind of funny little spins on the golden rule. We saw it with Hobbes and maybe a little bit with Locke, where it was don't treat others badly so that they won't treat you badly, right? Or treat others well so that they'll treat you well. There was this idea of reciprocity involved, right? And this is also, it's possibly an interpretation of the golden rule, but, for philosophers, the devil's in the details, right? And perhaps for anybody who's really trying to understand these rules, the devil is, of course, in the details. And also there are all kinds of strange sorts of scenarios too, where it's treat others the way that I would want to be treated. If that's the golden rule, then maybe the golden rule leads to some pretty bizarre places. What if I have all kinds of strange sexual kinks, and the way that I would want to be treated is very different than the way that most people would want to be treated, and so I should treat others the way that I want to be treated? Whoa, that could get really weird really fast. So it's going to have to be something slightly different. And one way that we can get into a sort of an articulation of what is going on here is recognizing that Kant is peddling a distinction between a categorical imperative and a hypothetical imperative. And here's what we mean by this distinction. For a categorical imperative, it usually takes the form of do, or perhaps don't do, if we want a negative formulation, X. Do X or don't do X. If you want to talk all fancy and King James Bible type and say do unto and stuff like that, we can say thou shalt, right? Thou shalt, blah, or thou shalt not, blah. Those are positive or negative categorical imperatives. Versus a hypothetical imperative, how would that be constructed? You saw this in your homework quiz as well. Yeah, there's something subjective about it. We'll get to that. And there's at least one hypothetical imperative that it's subjective, but but maybe it applies to everybody, and so that's a weird kind of subjective. But how would I construct this? Yeah, Corbin?
I think it's do or don't do X and less Y.
Yeah. Or maybe the way that that's really, really close. I'm going to say something that means almost the same thing, or maybe even exactly the same thing, but I'm just going to disambiguate it a little bit. If you wish X, then do or don't do Y. Yeah, I made it deliberately ambiguous there, right? If you wish X, so we could say if you want, maybe think about if you want X, right? So that would be one way that I can kind of disambiguate the usual understanding of the golden rule from what Kant's talking about in his categorical imperative by kind of pointing to the will-want distinction. Another way that I might kind of indicate this is if, the if part, that's the hypothesis in the hypothetical imperative, right? The do X or don't do X, or in this case it's do Y or don't do Y. Usually the way this gets talked about is that there's an implied ought in there, right? Some kind of ought concept doesn't work in any kind of imperative. So you ought to do X, or just the command, do X, or if you wish X, then you ought to do Y, or do Y. In a hypothetical imperative, that ought, the imperative part, is contingent on some if, right? There's a kind of contingency here. Whereas over here in the categorical imperative, this is categorical. It's not contingent on anything. It's categorical in the sense that we might say something like it's universal, it's absolute. It's not contingent on anything. And it does seem like the golden rule is constructed in such a way to be a hypothetical imperative. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Maybe. If what I interpret that as if I want this or if I wish this, it might even get into territory of like, yeah, if I will this, that construction of the if part that then says like, here's how I'm going to decide like whether I should do Y. It's contingent on whether or not this if part obtains. Now this is no longer a categorical imperative. This is a hypothetical imperative. I'll say more about the difference between categorical and hypothetical imperatives, but before we do that, I want to run us through some applications of this first formulation of the categorical imperative. And also, maybe, perhaps, worth mentioning in this way that like I'm not even going to try, given time constraints and my own feeble understanding of this material, I'm not even going to try to explain like how this jump gets made. But do we understand the difference, like even just the grammatical difference between a categorical imperative and a hypothetical imperative? Notice I said a categorical imperative or a hypothetical imperative. An hypothetical. How do you do H's? Are they an? A? Okay. If it's a hard H, right? But if it was like honor, it'd be a soft H, like an. It's been an honor. Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. So a categorical imperative versus the categorical imperative. Kant pretty much says like there's really only just one. We're going to get 3 or 4 formulations today. But they're all the same idea, he says. It's just the same rule expressed in a slightly different way. So, act always such that you could will the maximum of your action as universal law. We ran through one of these at our last meeting. What was it about? It was about lying. Rehearse it for me. Thou shalt not lie. That's the usual principle, right? Maybe I want to break it. Maybe I'm going to like, but this time I think I want to lie. Should I lie? Right, so yeah, let's think about how this works. Act always such that you could will the maximum of your action as universal law. So the first thing I do is I figure out the maxim of my action. So I'm thinking to myself, like, I want to lie. I want to be allowed to lie, right? I want to be allowed to lie. So the maximum of my action is, you are permitted to lie. Universalize it. Everyone's permitted to lie. This is what the cop says. Like, what if everybody could do that? All right, so everybody's allowed to lie. So now what? We could run this to a hypothetical imperative, right? We could run this to this idea that if everyone's allowed to lie, then it would be difficult to communicate with one another, perhaps even impossible to communicate with one another. We can't cooperate or collaborate on projects, and so like we get lonely, and we don't get to like do the stuff that we want to, and that's not fun, and nobody likes it. And it's a real bummer. We're in the state of nature, right? Something like that, right? We would have to live in the state of nature if everyone were permitted to lie whenever they wanted to. Or something like the state of nature. And nobody wants to live in the state of nature, so that's no good. So if you don't want to live in the state of nature, or if you don't want to live in a world where if you don't want to live in a world where people aren't able to communicate or cooperate or anything like that, if you don't want to live in a world where you think someone's going to X but they not X instead, then don't lie. But that has that if attached to it, right? It's contingent on what I might want. And we might even say something like, yeah, but no human would want that. But now this is contingent on human nature and what humans happen to want, right? And this is supposed to be the sort of thing that is universal. It's supposed to be the sort of thing that's absolute. It's supposed to be the sort of thing that's a priori. The sort of thing that we can be certain of and apply it in every single situation. If there was some weird alien race that was we actually enjoy chaos and miscommunication. So we are going to permit lying. We'd be all right, well have fun with that world, but I want no part of it. As long as they're rational, perhaps that's the sort of thing that could still fly. It's got to work a little bit differently. It's got to be this thing that the way that we worked through it was we recognized that if everyone's allowed to lie, then lying just doesn't mean anything at all. There is no lying. Nobody can lie, right? If everyone's allowed to lie, and the way that we kind of parsed this out was the only reason that anybody believes anything that anybody else says is that it's expected that you mean what you say. Not necessarily that it's true, but that you mean what you say at least. And if nobody has any kind of obligation to tell the truth, even a soft obligation to tell the truth, then it just doesn't make sense to lie. Lying isn't a thing anymore, because lying is unintentional deception. It's telling somebody something that is false, you know it's false, and you're trying to get them to think that it's true, but there's just no reasonable person would expect that anybody would believe that what they were saying in a world where anyone's allowed to lie. So it's because we ended up in this kind of position where we said if everyone's allowed to lie, then no one's allowed to lie. This is the sort of thing that makes an appeal to a rational will. Not to desire, not to wanting, but it is not the sort of thing that one could will with a rational will at all. It trips over itself. The concept of lying, when universalized, undermines the concept of lying. And this is how we would apply the first formulation of the categorical imperative. It's not so much like, oh, that would be a bummer and you wouldn't like it. Kant works through some examples where it's not an outright incoherent self-contradiction. He marks those as like special cases of application of the categorical imperative where he says like, not only could you not will that, you couldn't even think it. But you'll note if you go back and kind of like carefully comb through those passages where he's doing something slightly different than an utter incoherence, he is identifying that like what is motivating the person to try to make an exception to the rule for just this one case. And he kind of identifies that that's like all attempts to violate this first formulation of the categorical imperative end up being these instances where somebody seems to tacitly at least recognize that this rule needs to be in place, but there needs to be an exception for me just this once. And you might even be able to convince yourself that like we'll make a couple of exceptions, like for me and people like me in situations like this. But if what's needed in order to make that exception make sense is that the rule applies most of the time, then we're doing the same sort of thing. It's not the sort of maxim of an action that somebody could will as universal law. Because as soon as it is willed as universal law, it undermines whatever motivation there was to do this action in the first place. Is that fair enough? So perhaps if we put it in these terms. Do you want to give it a try? I think we might be able to rescue the Twix wrapper thing.
I was thinking about murder.
Oh, okay.
That seemed different to me than lying or stealing.
Yeah, we might not be able to get it out of the first formulation of the categorical imperative, which is like funny because I thought all of the different formulations were essentially the same thing, so I should be able to get all the rules out of any one. But yeah, hold on to murder for a second because we might be able to get it out of the second formulation. But what if the Twix wrapper thing was something like this? What if it was, the reason why I don't want to pick up the Twix wrapper is because I don't want to be inconvenienced. And so for the sake of my not being inconvenienced, I'm not going to pick up litter. But if nobody picks up litter, which is to say if everybody fails to pick up litter out of a motivation of convenience, right? Then pretty soon we're just like wading through like waist-high Twix wrappers. And guess what? That's pretty inconvenient. That's getting to this point where like we have something that could not be willed as a universalized maxim for action. Does that make sense? It's not so much that like, I wouldn't like it if everybody acted the way I'm about to act. It'd be the motivation for my action would undermine itself if everybody were allowed to do this. Or if this was willed as universal law. Does that make sense? And if we could do the same sort of thing, perhaps with Morgan Besser and the pipe lighting thing, which would be like if maybe the only thing that makes lighting one's pipe in the stairs down to the subway appealing is that it's like an open space where like nobody's going to disturb you. And we ask like, what if everybody did that? And like, well, if everybody did that, it actually wouldn't be a very good place to try to light your pipe. So maybe that is like what would make it fit the first formulation of the categorical imperative. And if you're thinking to yourself like, man, we are just like cutting these concepts razor thin. We are making really fine distinctions between actions based on like the subtlest of differences in motive. Recognize that this is everything for Kant. Motive is what this whole thing is all about. It's all about this question of like what is actually motivating an action? What would count as a moral motive? So as we established in our last meeting, you can act in ways that are consistent with the moral law. You can act in ways such that you're doing the action that somebody who would do the right thing would also do. But this doesn't necessarily count as something with any moral worth. You could be the kind of person that like trips and catches the baby, or the kind of person that builds the evil weather machine and turns out that you accidentally make good weather. And like in all of those cases, we're saying like there was no actual moral value to that action because it wasn't motivated in the right sort of way. Fair enough? Okay. Want to try another one? We did lying. Let's do stealing. It's another commandment. Is that another? Like it's been a long time since Sunday school. It is another commandment. Anybody? I know there are like variations in the numbering. Which commandment is the stealing one? 8? All right. 8th commandment: Thou shalt not steal. Like really? What about just this once, just for me? What does it mean to steal? Take something that doesn't belong to me, like a gift.
Without permission.
Without permission. Okay. Or like borrowing something. Yeah. Like without permission, right? So there's something that, when I say it doesn't belong to me, does it belong to somebody else? Yeah. Okay. Because if it doesn't belong to anybody, then maybe Locke's right. I can just pick it up and I've mixed my labor with the land and now it is mine, right? Yeah. But if it belongs to somebody else and I take it without their permission, I've stolen, right? Okay. So let's test this against the first formulation. What if everybody could do that? If everybody could do that, then like, yeah, good. Right. Yeah, if stealing is always permissible, or stealing is permissible for all, right? The whole point of like stealing is like, I want property to be respected, just not this once, and not for me this time, right? Because once I steal from you, like now I want it to be mine. If every time I steal something from somebody else says like, oh, stealing's okay, yoink, they take it from me. Like whatever motive there was for me to take something from you and try to make it mine has now evaporated. Now we could go to this place where like we like follow a hypothetical imperative not to steal, where it's kind of like if you don't want to live in a world where like you don't get to like do anything with the stuff in your possession because it might get taken away from somebody at any given moment, or you can't set something down for just a moment while you do something else because somebody else might come and take it. And that would be a bummer. Who would want to live in that world? We would have maybe a compelling argument for why it's a bad idea to steal, but I don't know that we would have a categorical moral law that forbids it in all cases. In order to have that categorical moral law, we've got to do, as Jack was suggesting, we've got to be able to articulate that if everyone's allowed to steal, then property just doesn't make sense anymore. It's an incoherent concept. And if there's no property, there's no theft. Theft requires property.
Then it's just a community of everyone borrowing everything, so you never have to buy anything.
Yeah. So this is interesting, yeah. So note that this is not necessarily an argument for like property laws that need to be respected at all times in civil society and the state of nature, like everywhere. This is saying there's no stealing. So perhaps this is consistent with the notion that there's just no property, period. Maybe we can get away with saying like, there is no property. Everything is everybody's property, which is to say there is no property. Maybe that could work.
Except for the people who have the most means to like lock their property away.
Yeah, maybe. Or we might also start to run into, this might run afoul of like third and fourth category that are like, they're going to be here. That's why I'm pointing over it. Like third and fourth categorical imperative formulations. But yeah, it's maybe with just the first formulation, it's hard to see how there would be any kind of necessity of property as a concept in the first place. But if there is property, then stealing is forbidden. Absolutely. In all cases. It cannot be consistent with the universal moral law to steal. Yeah, that's kind of like how this would apparently go, right? If there's property, then there can't ever be permissible instances of stealing. And not just like legally permissible, there are no morally permissible instances of stealing. Pearson. A maxim is just, it's a rule. It's kind of like putting that, so an action is not a rule, right? It's kind of making a rule that prescribes the action, or proscribes the action, I suppose, right? Depending on if we're talking about a negative or a positive sort of a formulation. So getting to this, like making the imperative out of it, right? Making it into a like do this, or like you may do this, or thou shalt do this, or not do this. That's the maxim of an action. The action is the stealing. The maxim of the action is the rule that supposedly would motivate your action.
It sounds like you're universalizing the action rather than
It's willing the maxim of the action as universal law, so like this would then prescribe that action for all cases. Which, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe there is like a little bit of a jump for like we've prescribed that action in all cases, but we're perhaps assuming that that action actually does get performed.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering, like, what if you do a charity, and you ask, well, what if everybody does that? And then they're all just donating to the same charity, and then, like, it doesn't actually help, because now it's turning out way too much money.
I don't know if there is such a thing as a charity with way too much money.
I mean, if everyone, like, we're talking about universally now.
Right. Yeah, if everyone in the world like donated
Let's say you
to like famine relief. Yeah. Then would it?
It would make sense that charity would just cover all aspects of.
Yeah, and we might also suggest that like, well, we said everybody donates to charity, so then like perhaps like the operators of that charity then like have all this extra money and they donate that to like other charities or something. But this is interesting. Yeah. What's that? We're not saying that it's enforced by the sovereign authority of the government necessarily. We're just saying it's enforced by the moral law, which is to say, like, everybody ought to do it, and if they don't, they're failing in their obligation.
And if everyone donates to charity, would the people that need the charity be donating to the same charity also? They get the money from the charity.
We might be able to formulate it, and like, yeah, we're getting into interesting territory. Good. I'm glad you guys are like picking at this a little bit. We might get into territory, and tell me if you think that this, like, I'm pulling a fast one on you here. Might say something like, if you have the means, you must donate to charity.
Just don't donate to charity.
Well, Kant takes this up, right? He says, like, it's not about giving to charity necessarily, it's about helping people, right? This is one of the examples that he works through, and he says, like, somebody needs my help, but I decide, like, I don't want to help them because it's inconvenient to me. Well, what if everybody didn't help others just because it was inconvenient for them? Then he says, you will inevitably end up in a situation where, like, you need help, and now, like, for the sake of your convenience, you have inconvenienced yourself. And this makes no sense. But like, he's in rockier territory there. And we might think about it like, well, does the converse work as well, right? So like, you must donate to charity. You must help in every single instance. And this does not get parsed in the groundwork very well. It's the sort of thing that gets parsed in other works a whole lot better, certainly not in chapters 1 or 2 of the groundwork. But there's a distinction perhaps to be made between perfect duties, which are the sorts of things that get covered by the categorical imperative. Perfect duties are perfect in a grammatical sense. Maybe it's going to be easier to like understand perfect duties in contradistinction to imperfect duties. So again, imperfect in a grammatical sense. Have you learned the imperfect tense in any like language classes that you've taken? I'll put you on the spot here. Like, what is the imperfect tense? It's an ongoing action, right? Yeah, it's an action that like has like already begun and it's not completed yet. So imperfect duties are the sorts of things that cannot possibly be completed in any one action. They're usually prescriptions, positive prescriptions to like do something. So help those in need. Like you can't help everybody in need in one shot. You can, it makes no sense to like constantly be helping people in need to the negligence of other things that you might have to do, right? Because you might have like other sorts of moral obligations that like you also have to fulfill in addition to helping people in need, and how can you do it all at the same time? So Kant says, these are imperfect duties. You're always supposed to be chipping away at it. You're always supposed to be working towards it. But it's not the sort of thing that you can fail in just like one instant. Perfect duties, on the other hand, are things that you can complete in one shot. And you'll note also that like most of the versions of things that run afoul of the categorical imperative in its various formulations are violations of proscriptions, things where they're thou shalt not rules. Thou shalt rules tend to be the sorts of things where like you can't just like do it all the time. But you can refrain from doing prohibited things all the time. Does that make sense? So if it was something like, thou shalt not murder, and you're like, okay, but like, what am I supposed to go around like not murdering all the time? Like, when will I have time to eat or sleep? And you're like, no, actually, whenever I'm doing something else, I am not murdering, right? I guess depends on the something else I might be doing. But yeah, sure. Not murdering doesn't get in the way of like other things, right? It's refraining from certain actions. So yeah, we got that distinction between perfect and imperfect duties. Okay. Where does the time go? That was a rhetorical question. So there's a whole kind of like a meandering middle ground between what's handled here and how we get into the second formulation of the categorical imperative. I'll see if I can fill in some of those gaps after we get this established, but I don't want to not get this on the board. So eventually we'll end up getting this second formulation of the categorical imperative. And if all we had was the first and second formulations, it would be awfully difficult, I think, to try to figure out how it is that these are just slightly different expressions of the same idea. By the time we get the third and fourth on the board, we start to see like, oh, I see, it's all hanging together as one coherent sort of description of what moral duty is like. And also, P.S., did we get how, like, this first formulation, it really isn't anything a whole lot more exotic than just an articulation of what it means to act from duty to the moral law. Like, if moral law is absolute and universal, then the maxim of our action being universal law is just like acting according to universal law, and acting from a sense of duty is acting from a rational will, right? So act always such that you could will that the maxim of your action as universal law. This is just a fancy way of describing what it means to act from a sense of duty to the universal moral law. If there was a universal moral law, and I was going to act not just accidentally according to it, not because I was threatened into it, not because I had an inclination to do so that might evaporate tomorrow, but if I was motivated in the right sort of way towards a universal moral law, that's what it would look like. So when I say this doesn't just kind of like fall from the sky and Kant doesn't just make it up, it's the kind of principle that gets like shaken out of these concepts. The second formulation of the categorical imperative seems to just kind of come out of nowhere, though. And it looks like this. Treat humanity. All right, let's keep it consistent. Act such that you treat humanity either in your own person or somebody else always as an end in itself and never as a mere means. This one's also kind of commonly, I think, known. Maybe not as commonly assumed to be understood as the first formulation. But this is a version of the categorical imperative that, for example, we might be able to get some really robust sense of universal human rights, especially a right to liberty. At our last meeting, I was talking about slavery as being the sort of thing that, like, we want to be able to say that it's wrong in all cases. Slavery clearly violates the second formulation of the categorical imperative. Do we understand like what's going on here? So one of the things that like gets employed here is a distinction between means and ends. Are we clear on that? Yeah. What are ends? Ends are goals, right? Yeah. Yeah, right, yeah. So I can think about this like in a positive sense, some goal that I want. I can also think about it maybe in a negative sense where like ends are both prescribing and proscribing certain sorts of actions. I can also understand categorical and hypothetical imperatives in terms of means and ends, whereas categorical imperatives are ends in themselves. And I'll notice that hypothetical imperatives, the imperative to do Y is a means to getting to X, right? And as it turns out, lots of things that are ends also are they're also means as well. For example, you came to class today. What motivated you to do that? Why'd you come to class? Consequences? You wanted to avoid those consequences? What consequences did you want to avoid? Miss too many days and you fail. And you don't want to fail. You want to pass. Let's make it something positive. I came to class because I want to pass. Why do you want to pass? You can pay money for the class but not pass it, right? And still get the knowledge. So what were you paying the money for? Not to get the knowledge. The degree, right? Yeah, if I don't pass the class, I don't get the degree. So I came to class as a means. Coming to class wasn't the end in itself. That wasn't like my end. It was a means to another end, which is to pass the class. Passing the class as an end, look at that. It's a means to another end, which is to graduate. Graduating, is that an end in itself, or is that a means to another end? It's a means to another end. Does this ever end? This kind of means to ends? Like, is there an ultimate end? If you took the ancient philosophy class, you might remember that Aristotle took this question up at the very beginning of his Ethics, and he says, everybody always has a reason for the stuff that they do, but that reason is usually for some other reason, and some other reason, and some other reason, and if you follow the Y chain far enough, you'll eventually get back to happiness. Yeah, everybody wants to be happy, but it's a very specific kind of a conception of happiness. It's not happiness as a feeling, it's happiness as an accomplishment. It's flourishing, perhaps. It's eudaimonia is the word that gets used. And Kant actually entertains this. If you're interested in a kind of a comparative sort of a study of Kant and Aristotle on this concept, you can go check out what it is that Kant has to say in Chapter 2 about happiness, because he identifies it as a really weird sort of a thing that is the sort of thing that it seems like all humans want it, sure, but it also seems like there's no clear sense of some sort of necessary or sufficient means to that end. Yeah, and as a result, it's contingent, it's circumstantial, it's the sort of thing that seems to fit more hypothetical imperatives than it does. It's not a good candidate for a categorical imperative. So, in this discussion of means and ends, Kant identifies that somehow we've got to be able to find a way to set ends in a way that the reason for that end is not as a means to some other end, right? There's got to be some kind of ultimate end. And he entertains briefly, maybe it's happiness, and he's no, that's not going to work. And maybe we get a sense that there's also this kind of willing, wanting thing, and Kant just, because he's German, he doesn't really care about being happy. And maybe not just German. Because he's Lutheran, maybe he just doesn't care that much about being happy. German's, okay, good enough. I know plenty of Germans who care about being happy, but yeah, they're not Lutherans. So yeah, there's got to be some other way to fix it. And Kant also, then this kind of turns into a meandering sort of an exploration. As soon as these terms means and end come into the conversation, if you're familiar with this second formulation, the categorical imperative, you know that it's coming. He started talking about means and ends, it's in the works, where is it going to come from? And he starts wondering this question about, how is it that these ends do get set? And he comes back to this whole little cluster of concepts, and he says, well, they have to be set according by, a rational will. They have to be rational ends. And then he starts wondering, okay, so what could possibly be an end in itself? What's the sort of thing that, if there's anything that could be desired for no other reason than because it's to be desired? We've been playing around with some of these things so far. We talked about reason. Is there a reason to be reasonable? If you're even asking that question, you've already committed to, reasonableness. Maybe doing the right thing. Why should I do what I should do? There you go. We don't need to parse that any farther. There doesn't need to be any sort of explanation for why you should do what you should do. You should do what you should do because it's what you should do. And the other thing that he kind of like ropes into this, besides reason and morality, is this recognition that like there needs to be some sort of entity that is like the determiner of these things. There needs to be something that can recognize an end as a worthy end in itself. There needs to be something that can recognize a maxim of action to be reasonable, or a maxim of action to be good, or to be aimed towards the good for no other reason than because it's the good, or because it's the right thing to do. And Kant says there's only one, what seems to him, and he's kind of like searching his imagination, which is always like a weak move for a philosopher to say like, this is the only thing that I can like think of as an answer to this question. Descartes kind of does this too at some points, and you're like, I don't know about you, but I'm always wondering, like, maybe your imagination's just not that good. Maybe there are other ways to, like, figure this out. And perhaps there are other ways, and that might not matter. All that really matters is that there is one thing that definitely seems to be an end in itself, and it's the kind of being that can recognize ends. If there isn't a kind of being that can recognize ends, then there are no recognizable ends, right? There are no maxims of action that like prescribe ends. This whole thing seems to like almost necessarily fall apart. And the kind of being that can recognize ends is a rational being. Or a human being. He also talks about humanity. Like, that's a little bit of a jump, that maybe we're kind of associating humanity with rationality or the capacity for moral judgment or something like this. But essentially what we're identifying here is like the sorts of things that are capable of identifying ends are also ends in themselves, because without them there are no ends. And I realize that when I just said that, it almost seems like the kinds of things that can identify ends are a means to the end of like ends. But pay no attention to the man behind the curtain there. Something definitely seems to be going on here, though. There might be a little bit of a puzzle to it. There might be places where Kant kind of like trips over the language. There might be places where I trip over Kant's language, where you might. Yeah, and it's a muddy transition from the first formulation to the second formulation. But what we end up with is this recognition that like if other people are capable of identifying ends, then that is the sort of thing to be respected. As soon as you start treating people as a mere means to ends, and not as an end in themselves, you're just not treating people as people. You're treating them as objects. This is what a slave is, right? A slave is just a tool to get like the shit that you want to get done. Yeah, he recognizes you can't like commit suicide for this reason. Yeah, this is like either in your own person. Yeah, we might have just like gotten away with that someone else. Don't treat others as a mere means to an end. Always treat them as an end in themselves. And he's like, no, don't treat yourself as a mere means to an end. That might be clearer, right? If you treat yourself as a mere means to some end, well, who set that end? You did. Perhaps it's clear where this is going to run afoul of the first formulation of the categorical imperative too, right? You undermine your own maxim in treating yourself as a means to some end. But this also raises some interesting questions that are not necessarily about suicide. They might be things like sacrificing yourself for the good of a larger group, like throwing yourself on a grenade or something like that. If the idea there is like I use myself as a means to some end, this is kind of peculiar, right? If the end was respectable at all, it was because I set the end. But if I negate me and my own will, this is another way of thinking about this. This is about like recognizing entities that have a will of their own and respecting that free will. And if I deny somebody else's will for the sake of my will, let's connect the dots. What if everybody did that? Let's run that through the first formulation of the categorical imperative. What if everybody was allowed to undermine other people's wills for the sake of their own wills?
What everybody does nowadays anyway?
Well, they try, right? But I think they do it in the same way that people lie and cheat and steal and break promises and like violate all sorts of other things that are clear violations of the first formulation, which is, I assume everybody else is going to follow this rule, but I get to be the exception. So I'll try to manipulate other people. I'll try to use other people as a mere means to my ends. But if I actually sat and thought about, like, seriously, like, what if everybody did that? then like my ends don't get respected either. And the whole point of undermining other people's ends for my own ends was so that I could satisfy my own ends, but if everybody's allowed to do that, then nobody gets to satisfy their ends. We might even think about this in terms of, like, we can bring this back to lying as well, right? Or to, like, keeping secrets from people or being manipulative. This is, like, classic situation comedy sort of fodder. There's, like, how many different sitcoms have you seen where, like, everybody starts lying to everybody else in order to get what they want? And because everybody's lying to everybody else, nobody's able to do what they want. Like, nobody can kind of like coherently execute their will because everybody's constantly undermining everybody else at every turn. Or if not, like, yeah, I said sitcoms. You can see this in a whole lot of like reality TV as well, right? Everybody's trying to undermine everybody else, and as a result, nobody gets what they're trying to get.
Or our government.
Or perhaps our government as well, yeah. Treat humanity, either in your own person or that of others, always as an end in itself, never as a mere means. And notice this is end in itself, not as like an end that can be like a means to another end, as an end in itself. And also note this, never as a mere means to an end. Never as a mere means to an end. Some folks might look at this formulation of the categorical imperative and say to themselves, I use people as a means to my own ends all the time. Is that like wrong? Should I not be doing that? Well, some folks might look in and say, like, I do this all the time, therefore this can't be the moral law. And it's like, well, those people are like way too conceited to like suppose that the shit that they're doing is not wrong. But we might stop at like the more, humble amongst us might say like, oh man, I do this all the time, but like, am I wrong to do it? For example, my car needs to be worked on. I don't have the know-how to do it to myself. I'll bring it to my mechanic because she does know how to fix my car. Am I using her as a means to an end? It kind of seems like I am. She's also using me. That's twice as bad then, right? I'm using her to get my car fixed. She's using, what's she using me for? She's using me for money. Is commerce a violation of the second formulation of the categorical imperative?
Your voice got higher, so I think the answer is no.
We need to make a distinction between mere means and what's usually referred to as mutual means. Good use of context clues there, Corbin. And notice the difference between mutual means and mere means. In a scenario of mutual means, let's say the one with me and my mechanic, I'm using her to get my car fixed. She's using me to get some money. What if, well, first of all, like, do I want this arrangement where I get my car fixed in exchange for money? Does she want that arrangement where I get my car fixed in exchange for money?
Yep.
We both got what we wanted then, right? We both got what we wanted. We both got what we willed, perhaps. We were both free-willing participants in this exchange. As soon as I say something like, I would like my car fixed, and she says, I would like $500, and I say, I would not like my car fixed that much, and she says, too bad, I already fixed your car, give me the money. You're like, whoa. We did not both enter into that agreement on equal footing, respecting each other's free wills, right? The ability for either party to kind of say, like, no deal, that's not okay for me, I'm kind of getting out of this. As long as that's respected, then mutual means is just fine. But we'll also note, perhaps, that there's like a huge, nasty swamp of ambiguity going on in here as well, because there are all kinds of things that look like commercial exchanges, that look like plausible instances of mutual means where the two parties are not on equal footing, where one person is coerced into like a business relationship with another person. Maybe it's like a child who's working in a sweatshop. Maybe it's an addict who's like selling their body on the street. Or maybe it's somebody who's selling their body on the street because they don't want to get the shit kicked out of them by their pimp or something like that. Those are situations where like sometimes folks will be like, they got money, I got what I wanted, so like what's the problem? Well, the problem is we weren't really respecting everybody's free will equally there. I wasn't respecting humanity as an end in themselves. I saw them as something to exploit. If the sorts of business arrangements that I enter into are the sorts of things where, like, I am knowingly attempting to exploit somebody else's bad situation. I am not respecting people as an end in themselves. I am still treating them as a mere means to an end. What's that? What's the first one? Oh, back to here? Not universalizable, right? Yeah. Good, because these are the same idea, just expressed slightly differently. Kind of hard to see how that would work, but we also get how, like, yeah, this is categorical imperatives are about, like, ends in themselves. This is about, like, the ability of rational agents to set ends. And if there is no ability to, like, set and achieve ends, then, like, none of this matters. This business of, like, act always such that you could will the maxim of your action as universal law, that's incoherent if nobody's ability to set ends for themselves, to act according to, like, a maxim of action that they could will as universal law, if this is not the sort of thing that is, like, reasonably achievable, then it falls apart. It becomes incoherent. If this is the sort of thing that cannot be universalizable, universalizable? You know what I'm saying. If you can't universalize this, and the violation of this is the sort of thing that seems like it's not universalizable. The whole point of using somebody as a mere means to an end is I'm placing my ends above their ends. And if that gets universalized, then nobody's ends get recognized or respected. What's that? Yeah, but it's a world without morality, right? It's a world without just without morality. It's a world without moral agents. And so we can never say that, like, that it's good that it's that way, right? Or that how you should act or anything like that. Like, should just evaporates. It goes out of the conversation. And anybody with the capacity for rationality should be able to recognize that, like these are kind of necessarily circular, maybe, but perhaps virtuously circular, because what recommends this sort of style of thought is its coherence and the recognition that, like, if I got outside of it, it's not just that there would be a different sort of coherence, but that, like, I wouldn't be able to see things as they actually are. It is entirely metaphysically possible to treat other people like they're not people, to just treat people like objects and like things. I'm just not treating them as what they are. We can think about this as, like, an epistemic error, not just a moral error. It's treating people as something other than what they are. And it's regarding them as something other than what they are. Matthew, you've been patiently holding your hand up. Sorry to leave you hanging. What's on your mind? That's okay. And it means not mutual means, right? You can use people as a means to an end, but they have to be okay with it. They have to say, like, this is what I want to. Not necessarily that I want to be used as a mere means to an end. This would be the sort of thing, almost everybody that we've seen in the second half of the semester has said something like this. This would be like submitting myself to slavery, right? And that's the sort of thing that Kant would say, like, it's not just somebody else, it's also yourself. Like, don't treat yourself as a mere means to an end. So this would have to somehow satisfy my ends and your ends at the same time. Fair enough? Okay, yeah. That's the mere part of mere means. That doesn't mean that, like, we can't trade goods and services with one another. It just means that when we do so, everybody's got to be able to get what it is that they're after. Could treating somebody as a means satisfy so this is the thing. Could it satisfy a universalizable maxim? To treat somebody as a mere means to an end? Yeah, it seems like, it couldn't be a universalizable maxim that way. Because if it was, then I also get treated as a mere means. And, like, now where are the ends? Who's setting the ends? Nobody is, right? And the whole point of treating somebody as a mere means is a mere means to an end. Right? There are no means without ends. Charles, you had your hand up.
If I, like, entering the mutual means with somebody and my end is moral, but I recognize that the end that they're trying to achieve through our arrangement isn't moral, would entering into it with them be immoral on my part?
What a lovely segue into the third and fourth categorical imperative formulations. Thank you. So that's to say, I'm not going to answer that question right away, but by the time I'm done with this, hopefully in less than 4 minutes, we will be. Third/fourth, with a question mark, because it's not clear that this is actually an official formulation of the categorical imperative for Kant, but it's also, for my money at least, as a reader of Kant, the third, all on its own, seems like it just doesn't add anything to the conversation. And and I think this is exactly how I worded the quiz question, if the big puzzle between the first and second formulation is how are these the same idea? The third formulation is the sort of thing where it'd be how is that not something that we've already said? So the third formulation, just making sure I don't bungle it here, is act only so that the will can regard itself as giving universal moral laws through its maxim. Now, I don't know about you, but that looks almost identical to the first formulation of the categorical imperative, which was act always such that you could will the maximum of your action as universal law. This is act only so that the will can regard itself as giving universal moral laws through its maxim. The giving universal moral laws through its maxim is not the really interesting part of this. It's the will regarding itself as giving universal moral laws through its action. So what's focused on here, and perhaps, hopefully, it's becoming clear that these third and fourth articulations of the categorical imperative are starting to stray into political territory, perhaps territory that we've already seen something really, really similar to this already, specifically in Rousseau and the concept of the general will. That's the territory that we're getting into here with the third and fourth. And then there's a fourth that Kant doesn't say it exactly like this. It's kind of cobbled together by other readers of Kant afterwards from the conversation that's surrounding the third formulation that I just wrote. And it usually gets phrased thusly. And I'm going to write it in green so we don't mistake it for something that Kant actually said. And it usually goes something like this. Act in accordance with the maxims of one who gives universal laws for a possible, I think Bennett uses the word realm here, but usually it gets translated as kingdom, a kingdom of ends. And what's getting conveyed here in this notion of a kingdom of ends is that it's not just me who's making universal laws. So here in the third formulation we get this idea that the laws get applied, they get identified and made and prescribed to oneself. I am both law giver and law receiver. If that sounds familiar, this is like Rousseau almost in a nutshell, right? You are subject and citizen at the same time. And then in this kind of kingdom of ends articulation, what we usually end up with is this idea that it's got to be coordinated such that everybody is law giver and law receiver. Everybody is citizen and subject at the same time. The only way this could possibly work, by the way, is if everything else that we've said previously was true, which is that the maxims of action that everybody wills as universal law are the sorts of things that everybody else could also will as universal law. That's the only way that we're going to be able to coordinate everybody's will. If it's just something that's set according to desire or inclination, that's not necessarily going to work. So, making sure that I answer Charles's question, which is respecting somebody's will if they were going to do something immoral, maybe this gets addressed here in this kind of act always in such a way that you were living in the kingdom of ends. So this is always treat everybody as if, and this is probably good advice for a lot of things. I've avoided so many unnecessary spats and fights with people by following this bit of advice that somebody gave me once when I was younger, which is when somebody acts like an asshole, just respond to them as if they were acting completely normally and morally acceptably. And you would be amazed at how far this could go. So this does not necessarily say try to undermine their will, but it's maybe treat them in such a way that I like assume that they're also a rational being like me and that they're going to come to like rational conclusions like me. And maybe I'm the one that's wrong and maybe they're the one that's wrong. And this is perhaps why in this question of like the supposed right to lie from philanthropic concerns, if the murderer is looking for their victim and they say, do you know where they are? And I know where they are. I can't lie to them. But I also need to kind of like assume that they're the sort of person that like would conceivably be a fully functioning moral agent. And maybe this kind of explains how this works too. If we're thinking about like the example of the Gestapo that's looking for Anne Frank, I can't take away their ability to make a moral choice by manipulating them into doing the right thing. Because it wouldn't be the right thing if it wasn't motivated, right? If it wasn't motivated like autonomously. If they weren't able to choose it, it wouldn't be the right thing. And we can think, well, if everybody did that? If everybody did that, there would be no morality. There would, like, at best, be people tricked into acting as if they were moral. So this is a tightrope for sure, and it gets into all kinds of questions about, like, so how's punishment going to work? How are we going to enforce, like, political law? But fortunately, we're over time, and I don't have to get into that stuff. You can find that in the second critique, by the way. Critique of Practical Reason. Our next reading is going to be Mary Wollstonecraft. I will see y'all on Tuesday. Have a good weekend.